Good day to you, great people. This is your friend PDA, and today I will be telling you about a principle that has proven true from generations to generations. This is a principle that was discovered by an Italian economist who goes by the name Vilfredo Pareto. And this principle is named after him. And so we call it the Pareto principle. The Pareto principle. Some people also call it the 80-20 principle. 80-20 principle. Uh, Pareto discovered this principle by a research he conducted in Italy. And his research showed that 80% of the property that was in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. 80% property was owned by 20% of the citizens of Italy, while the remaining 20% was owned by 80%, the other 80% of the population. And later in time, Pareto also discovered from his garden that 80% of the fruit he harvested from his garden was produced by 20% of the plants that were in his garden. And so he came up with this principle called Pareto principle. And this principle simply says 80%, or rather, this principle says 20% of what you do accounts for 80% of your results. In other words, 20% of your efforts makes up 80% of your results. And this principle has been taken up by a lot of scholars and it has been found to be true. And even you, if you should take it up and think about it, you will discover that it is true. In every football team, there is a certain 20% of the team members that account for 80% of their results. Think of any great football team in the world. There are a few players, usually 20%, that makes them to be that good, that makes them to always win their matches. And if you take out these few players, these 20%, the team is as weak as every other team. 20% input makes up 80% of your output. That is what Pareto principle says. In businesses, 80% of your income comes from 20% of your customers. 80% of all the income you have gained in your business comes from just 20% of your customers. There are very highly profitable 20% among your customers who, if you should leave them out, your business becomes nothing. 20% of your customers account for 80% of your income. 80% of the important works in an organization is done by 20% of the employees. The critical works in every organization, they are done by just a certain 20% of the employees. And if you take out this 20%, then the organization becomes almost useless. And why the remaining 80% of the employees only account for 20% of the work that is being done. That is how Pareto principle works. Also, 20% of the people in your circle, maybe a circle of friends or a circle of the relationship you have with people, 20% of the people there gives you all the benefits you have ever had as a result of relationship or friendship. Just 20% of them. Also, 20% of the pages of a book gives 80% of the vital information that the book is promised to give. Why the remaining 80% accounts for just 20% of its value. And then, even if we are to talk about church, 80% of the income that comes in is donated or given by 20% of the members, whereas the remaining 80% of the members, what they contribute is just 20% of the income. The 80-20 principle, the Pareto principle. Now, let me say this. Sometimes it may not be literally 80-20. Sometimes it may be 70-30. It may even be 90-10. This principle is metaphoric in nature, but it gives a clear message. And the message it sends is that the minority of efforts makes up the majority of results. The majority of results comes from the minority of efforts. And I would like to tell you how this applies to you, or how you should apply this as I conclude. You know, the most successful people on this planet are not those who work the hardest. They are those who have sat down to discover the 20% of their input that accounts for the 80% of the results they have ever got. And these are the people who have decided to concentrate and focus on this 20%, on this 20% of input or of efforts that accounts for 80% of results. And sometimes you cannot just strike out the 80% input that account for just 20% of results. You may not be able to strike it out completely. But the message here is a message of priority. The issue here is an issue of priority. You must prioritize the 20% of input that makes up 80% of results over the 80% of input that makes just 20% of results. Find this out in your circle of friends. Find this out in your organization. Find this out in your business. Find this out in all your endeavors and prioritize the 20% that accounts for the majority of the results you aspire to get. The Lord bless you. Till the next time we are going to be meeting, I remain your friend, PDA. See you again.